Hey, good evening. I'd like to call the Anacortes City Council meeting of 8 August 2022 to order. Mr. Franciak, would you please take the roll?
Mr. Carter.
Present.
Mr. Young. Mr. Walters.
Here.
Ms. Cleland McGrath.
Here.
Ms. Moulton.
Here.
Mr. McDougall.
Here.
Ms. Hubick.
Here.
Thank you.
Would you all please join me in the pledge?
Mayor Miller,
Mr. Carter.
I'd like to excuse Mr. Young from tonight.
He just joined, so we can
Never
note
mind.
that Mr. Young has joined the council meeting. All right, announcements and committee reports. Just a couple for me. Seemed all reports were a successful arts festival over the weekend. A lot of folks in town. Also, 32nd and M, it is open. I have driven it. I know a number of you on council have probably driven through there. It's not quite complete. There's still some landscaping to do, and probably more importantly for the public's knowledge, about 2 or 3 weeks for the flashing crosswalk sign. So they're coming, but the roundabout's operating, and just a reminder, it is a roundabout. So you have to yield to traffic in the circle, even if you're driving on 32nd. So, all right, so that's it from me. Over to Fiber Committee. Mr. McDougall.
Yeah, the Fiber Committee met last week, Ms. Hubick, Mr. Walters, myself, and we reviewed, start with the numbers. As of the meeting, we had 1,491 customers on network, and that's residential and commercial or business. So essentially at the rate we've been going installs per day, we should have crossed 1,500 either Friday or today. So that's a cool milestone. Zip through the notes. RBC is basically done with West End construction of the backbone. They're just doing the final punch list. Our installers, though, they're continuing basically at a kind of a pace of about 40 or 20 installations a week, especially in the West End where the installations are all a lot of underground work, so it takes a little bit longer. So they have a backlog of a few hundred installations that they're working through. So that's also good because it means we got a lot of signups that we're going to be turning up in the next several months. We've got the Guimas View expansion. We've got a construction contract with Summit X signed, and we took care of that a couple weeks ago. They're expecting work to begin late September partially because we've got long lead times on equipment. Essentially, like fiber itself has like 40-week lead times. And finally, some staffing news. Kimberly Henry, our business coordinator, went to another opportunity. So they've interviewed the 3 finalists that the team is excited about, and also they've got an individual who's kind of filling in the interim. So things are going well there. And I think that's primarily it.
Okay, thanks. Housing Affordability Community Services Committee, Mr. Walters.
Mayor Miller. Last Wednesday at the heart of Anacortes, council members Moulton, Cleland McGrath, and Police Chief Floyd and I held a Ward 1 community meeting. And because it was the same council members, we kind of morphed it into a Housing Affordability and Community Services Committee meeting. This was a tag-on to the previous meeting that we'd held earlier in the month. There was about a quarter or maybe a third of the attendees at last week's meeting who were at the meeting at the beginning of the month. So a lot of good repeat attendance, but also a lot of new faces, probably about 70 people there. Chief Floyd provided an overview of his department's response to homelessness and RVs, but actually a lot of the conversation focused on drug issues. Which was consistent with the previous meeting. Many people expressed frustration with a couple particular drug houses that have persisted for many years, and council members committed to put resources into that fight. We then debriefed this at our Housing Affordability and Community Services Committee meeting the next morning, because it's the same council members, and because we were sitting with the planning department, the standard municipal law prescription for drug houses to employ the obvious tools that we have the land use code, the international property maintenance code, the nuisance code, the prohibition against maintaining a junkyard, to deal with drug houses. Drug crimes are sometimes a little bit harder to get eyes on the actual transaction that is the source of a criminal law violation, but we've got a lot of civil tools at our disposal. And so we understand APD and planning and the city attorney's office have been having those conversations now, and we are looking forward to some action on that. Thank you.
Thanks. Planning Committee,
Mayor Miller?
Ms. Moulton.
Thank you. The Planning Committee just met before this, Councilmember Cleland, McGrath, Walters, and I, as he just sort of referenced. And the subjects included the Shoreline Master Program update that's being worked on by the Planning Department. The third draft is complete, and it has incorporated the Planning Committee's recommended changes. That will be coming to Council on September 12th for our feedback and discussion. Then it will go back to staff for final edits before it will be opened up for public comments. So that's coming up. And as Councilmember Walter said, we talked about the collaboration, the coordination between the Planning Department, the APD, and the City Attorney on nuisance abatement for different areas of our community. Thanks.
Public Safety Committee,
Mayor Miller.
Mr. Carter.
On the police side, we're still down a couple positions on staffing, and it's getting harder to try to find people to get through the door. So we're looking at how to streamline that, how to advertise to get people to come out and apply for the police department. Also, the school resource officer, we're seeing the benefits of having the officer in the school and the number of calls out to the school of actually having someone in there. And we're looking at expanding that program, but slightly. Currently, the lack of funding is down a little bit, and so we're looking at keeping that partnership between the school and the city to be able to pay for that. Also, one of our officers, Janet Wilson, was selected to be part of the crisis negotiator team for the county. And all the staff is currently going through the patrol tactics training because of the bill I-940. And here shortly, we should be able to get everyone trained up ahead of time based on the deadline for the bill. On the fire side, we are interviewing assistant chiefs to try to backfill that position. And they're also working on the budget for next year. And Station 3 study should be back hopefully in September. And then kind of the next steps that we're looking for is having a stakeholder meeting based on what things should go into the station, adding items taken away for future development. And then, in case I missed anything, I was pulled away slightly during the fire side of the update there. Other than that, that's about it.
Okay, Finance Committee,
Mayor Miller.
Mr. McDougall.
Finance Committee met last week. We met primarily to review the OpenGov status, and the team also gave us a bit of a tour of the system itself. So the team's been actively importing all sorts of financial data as well as capital facilities plans data into the system, and then kind of gave a tour of doing all sorts of filtering and sorting based upon columns, sort of budgetary bars, numbers, and things like that. System, as we know, has quite a bit of flexibility there. We looked at the public view of the CFP, and there's some feedback that the finance department actually has for OpenGov, some minor changes they'd like to see made as far as how different sort of mouse overs kind of work and the data that would get automatically exposed, that sort of thing. Let's see. And yeah, also talking with them about a few other kind of sort of customizations, and can we also do our own kind of customizations to sort of database keys and things like that. But all in all, I think really good progress, and they're happy with the product as well. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, we're a little slow on OpenGov, but I think now we're starting to see some of I think it can help us certainly from our PDF version or paper version of a CFP to something a little more user-friendly that we can work on. Any other announcements, committee reports? Okay, we're on to item 4, public comment. This is an opportunity for members of the public to address the council on anything that's not on the agenda. And I have one person with their hand raised. Anybody here in City Hall? Yes, sure. Come on up. And if you please state your name and city you reside in.
Greetings, I'm Evan Saxton. I live here in Anacortes. I just wanted to add a little additional color commentary to the meeting that was hosted for the Ward 1 on Wednesday. There was some pretty, it was a nice meeting, an opportunity for our leaders to ask our neighbors to come out and offer their feedback about matters happening in their community. I was disappointed because it kind of seemed like it was an opportunity for neighbors to pile on and, air complaints, which we all have, air concerns, which we all have. But the tone, I felt, was rather disappointing just based on the fact that the rhetoric that was shared by some of the members went unchallenged. And one specific instance, a gentleman referred to our houseless folks in Anacortes as cockroaches, and said something about scurrying in the dark. There was other such things that were more minor, but I wanted to just, for future reference, ask our leaders that if such rhetoric, which I believe would be classified under hate speech, would be challenged by those leaders in our town. I think that that's important. Rhetoric is important. The words we use about the people in our community is important. And so I was disappointed by many aspects, but that was probably the largest that I had concerns about. And I just wanted to share my concerns. So,
Thank you.
thank you.
Okay, I've got somebody with their hands raised online. Somebody needs to help me with clearing the microphone. Rochelle? And please state your name and city, please.
Rochelle Kaloha. I just want to echo Evan's sentiment but I'm not going to be nearly as nice, and I never am. That was one of the most disgusting community meetings I have ever witnessed. I felt like it was just a bunch of well-meaning, polite, rich white people coming and pretending as if they actually cared about these people in our community. And it was like they were trying to come up with a way to lynch the people, the houseless, the drug addicts, everyone was so lumped in together. And that's not the case. Drugs are rampant in our entire community. We're a wealthy white community. There's a ton of drugs. So to focus on a couple of nuisance houses, I understand. They're not cool. But it was beyond disgusting to put together everybody. And the fact that nobody stood up to people and even yelled at houseless people saying, how do we get them? How do we get them? What do they have to be gotten for? And I just felt like the police chief and everyone was just trying to mob on these people and say, okay, this is how we all come together and catch the people. But that's not even the entire problem of Anacortes. It's the lack of resources. It's so many different things. And I'm highly troubled by the idea that our town is going to waste money on like creepy high definition cameras as well. Thank you. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Anybody else in City Hall want to address the council? Okay, moving on to our consent agenda, item 5. Council, Ms. Moulton.
Thank you, Mayor Miller. I would like to pull item 5C from the consent agenda.
Okay, 5C.
And I also move that we approve consent agenda items A and B.
Seconds.
Okay, a motion by Ms. Moulton, a second by Mr. Young to approve consent agenda items A and B. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, motion carries. Ms. Moulton, item 5C, Resolution 3095, waiving competitive bidding requirements for the purchase of public safety cameras.
Thank you. The reason I pulled this from the agenda is because, other than a brief mention at the public meeting on Wednesday, this was the first I had heard of this initiative to acquire public safety cameras for the city of Anacortes. I would just like to say that I think this would be better, would serve us better if it were on the regular agenda instead of the consent agenda, so we could have more details about the background, about the issues that we're trying to solve, how we're solving them. Because I think not only do I have questions about this as a citizen, some of my fellow constituents have approached me since the public meeting about this. So I spoke with Chief Floyd briefly before this meeting, and he is going to talk to us about the history, where this came from, and give us his thoughts on this before we bring it forward.
All right, that sounds like putting you on the spot, Chief Floyd. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As I explained to Councilmember Moulton, the purpose of the public safety cameras is, one, is a force multiplier. So at any given time, we could have between 3 and 5 officers on duty throughout the city. At minimum staffing level, it could be down as low as 2. These cameras allow us to be able to monitor areas where we've noted crime trends or anticipated public safety concerns, and be able to deter crime without the officer actually being there. There's also value in these cameras. If there's crimes that do occur, we're able to identify potential suspects and take enforcement action on those individuals based on the camera footage. Some of the misconceptions about the cameras. So these would be viewing areas that are already publicly viewable by any officer if they were standing on the street corner just watching. It's plain view, and we're not going to be trying to infringe on anyone's right to privacy. They're not going to be aimed in windows of residences, that kind of thing. It's only going to be viewing stuff that would be normally viewable by an officer if he or she was there in person. And furthermore, it allows the digital retention of that evidence that we would otherwise only have just a observation of and be able to document that. So video can be powerful in some of these cases where evidence is key. Is there any other questions regarding the intent or use of those?
Mayor Miller.
Mr. Carter.
It's my understanding that this particular company has systems set up in several other cities in the state, and that they've already been able to use this in order to catch a murder in one of our other cities, correct?
That is my understanding, correct.
Mayor Miller.
Mr. Walters.
I have a somewhat different concern about it, and simply that the item before us is authorization to waive the competitive bidding requirements for the purchase of public safety cameras. What we're talking about apparently is the purchase of 1 unit for $9,000, and I don't think we're getting the best deal. Also, if you look at the text of the resolution, it purports to waive the bidding requirements for the purchase of public safety cameras with no particular limit on the number or the dollar amount, and authorize sole source purchasing from one vendor. I've been to their website. I wasn't very impressed by their website. I tend to think we can probably do better simply in economy of public funds. I don't have any particular problem with deploying public safety cameras, especially Commercial Avenue, high visibility public areas where I think it is we're talking about. That makes sense to me. I do wonder about the evidentiary value of these, because if we're talking about catching drug deals, you should probably just turn around and do the drug deal with your back to the camera. People are going to figure that out. But the force multiplier effect that Chief Floyd talks about, I think really makes a big difference, or could make a big difference. But it makes the most difference if we can afford to buy more than one. It seems like maybe we should have quite a few more of these, say, on Commercial Avenue. So I don't think that this is the best course with this particular vehicle, that is the waiving of the competitive bidding requirements.
So,
This particular camera model is easily expandable. The unit that I had proposed, I talked with our IT specialist, and there are satellite cameras that we could easily link up to this system. This particular one would come with an integrated DVR that is, the base is 4 terabytes, so that allows plenty of camera footage to be retained and us to go back and access that before it's overwritten. The length of time that we would have to do that depends on the number of cameras that are deployed. Currently with one camera, we should have more than enough time to go back and retrieve whatever is necessary for use of evidence in a crime.
Mr. Carter.
Is there a timeline on if we were to send this out to bidding versus going forward with this and getting something in place for Oyster Run?
Well, I think the answer is maybe, but I think what Chief Floyd hasn't gotten into yet is all the other cities that sole sourced this camera with this company because of its unique capabilities. This was demonstrated at the Association of Washington Cities annual conference in Vancouver, and the issue with the demonstrated by a homicide detective that made the demonstration that resulted in an arrest for a homicide because the camera was there. But like Mr. Walters pointed out, it is exactly that kind of thing, like Oyster Run, for example, where these cameras can be force multipliers, where the police can't be everywhere, but a camera can't be everywhere all the time, but a camera can be somewhere all of the time. And that is the idea as far as the application. But as far as the sole source contract, and I'll let maybe Chief Floyd talk a little bit more about reviewing that versus other camera systems that the police department was looking at back in January. And then this opportunity came up through the Association of Washington Cities.
Yes, sir. So going back clear to beginning of the year, we've been talking with other camera vendors on the possibility of deploying these throughout the city. The first camera vendor that we were speaking with offered one standard configuration, and working with our contracts department, one of the concerns that was outlined there is the city didn't retain the sole final decision on where those cameras were placed, and to be able to move those, we would have to have the contractor come out and move those to a different location if we found that a crime trend in one area had subsided and increased in a different area. The other thing was this particular company that is on the agenda for tonight custom builds the camera to fit the needs that we have. No other camera vendor that I've found can custom build their camera system to fit our specific needs and what we're trying to achieve with the camera itself. Many of the other ones were also not designed for the purpose that we're looking at. There was several camera companies that I saw at the state chiefs conference that were designed for building security or to be put in place at specific facilities and not really movable at all. So I felt like this particular vendor achieved all of our goals as far as portability, custom configuration, and us having the ability to control when and where it's deployed.
Mayor Muller?
Oh, yeah, Ms. Swetnam, I was actually going to drag you into this for the sole sourcing issue, and maybe even if you can pull up the slide of the other cities that have done this.
I'm happy to address that, thanks. And thanks for the question, Councilmember Walters. I think it's always really good for us to be thoughtful and careful when we waive competitive bidding. So on this particular situation, as Chief Floyd said, we actually were talking with another camera vendor for a period of time and went through the process of trying to understand how they structure their camera deployment. And what we were running into is that it seems that the standard is to lease cameras, but to have the vendor retain control over the camera's location. And after talking with Chief Floyd about the plans for the camera's deployment, that didn't seem to meet the city's requirements. So the contract specialist and I looked at this pretty carefully, what this particular vendor was offering and what the specific needs were with the city, and came to the conclusion that it did meet the requirements of sole source resolution. Now, council can always decline to do that, but in terms of the city's legal risk for moving forward with a sole source resolution, I feel confident recommending that it is susceptible to a sole source declaration or resolution, excuse me. And I was able to find that there were 2 other agencies in the state, including the counties of, I think it was Chelan and Lincoln, who did sole source resolutions waiving competitive bidding to buy camera setups from the same company. So, and I think those were based on the unique characteristics of this particular vendor as well. So, so that I think made us feel more comfortable about moving forward with a sole source resolution. Again, council's not required to do that. And Mr. Carter asked the question about being able to go out to bid and get that turned around by Oyster Run. I think that time frame is probably pretty tight, because I think what's important about going out to bid on something like this is making sure that we're really clear in the specifications so that we don't end up with a low bidder who provides the kind of structure that we got from a previous vendor we talked with. So it would take a little bit of time, I think, to develop the specifications. And it's certainly possible that we could go out to bid, but with the lead time for, constructing the camera setup to meet the city's needs, that seems like an optimistic time frame. So.
Yeah, and I think sometimes you can create the requirements and have somebody build to those requirements, but sometimes somebody shows up with a system that already meets the requirements, and that's ultimately what APD did as they researched the different camera systems. And that, again, what a lot of other cities have done with this particular contract. I would love it to, I think I counted 15. Again, we've only confirmed with 3. But 15 that have sole sourced with this particular vendor, because it does meet the needs of many cities when it comes to this particular item.
Mayor Miller?
Mr. Young.
Yes, thank you. I think all of council members have made some great points about, what are the issues that need to be brought forward. I do agree that this is something I believe is a multiplier for our force and something that could be very useful for us. And to Mr. Carter's point, if that were possible, I would also be in agreement with that, because I also think that we could use it during the time of events, big events like the Oyster Run. But I'm also in agreement, with Ms. Moulton's perspective of this being not just a discussion we have in the consent agenda. I think this is also something that's worthy of coming fully before council. I agree that if in this being able to move forward with sole source, I'm also okay with that. But I would like to have a follow-up discussion about what our intent and how we can use this, so we have a deeper knowledge of why we're choosing this step. Chief, I totally agree with you. I think that this is something that may be very useful as a multiplier, but the discussion for not only us, but the public about when, where, how it would be applied, I think is also important to come forward for the public to have their way in. Thank you.
Ms. Cleland?
Yeah, thank you. I agree with what Mr. Walters said. I guess my biggest 3 points of concern is I would have liked to have seen it a full presentation and discussion instead of on the consent agenda, just because I don't think we really have a good understanding of what technology is being used, what kind of resolution is being captured for in the court system, if this is high enough resolution to actually make it through and be used as evidence. I also think that we haven't quite understood the scope of this project. I mean, what requirements do we need as a community? Have we decided, is this something we just want to pull out for specific events? Is this something that we want in the downtown core? Is it something we want to move around as we see crime kind of ebb and flow through different neighborhoods? But I think that those are really important discussions to have before we buy the first camera at $9,000, because how many more cameras are we going to need to round out this future project? I think we see this a lot at times in Public Works when a certain chunks of a project come through and we realize, like, no, there's three or four or five different phases. So to me, I understand the short-term desire to get something done for the September event, but to me, this is something that should probably be discussed further in a public safety meeting, committee meeting, and then also come to the full council, so that, you know, if it ends up being that we need to have 10 cameras or deployed, that's a significantly larger amount of investment, and what makes the most sense when we actually decide how we want to have that. Or maybe we go back and say that it is really just something we're going to pull out for very specific purposes, for 24 hours or 48 hours at a time. And so to me, that's my concern, is that we don't kind of go down this path of waiving competitive bidding, and then now we're stuck here without having thought through all of the implications and what we should have 10 years from now.
So again, I feel like the staff has done an excellent job of doing all that, because it's similar to whether you would have extra officers assigned for Oyster Run, for example, or whether you have the auxiliary patrol being additional eyes. This is simply a camera that allows, like I said, a camera. Officers can't be everywhere all the time. A camera can be at one place all the time. It is a camera. It is a good camera. It's being used by a number of other cities. It is something that, as a standalone, it can serve that purpose much like a standalone additional officer can do. And its execution of law enforcement. I don't believe there are policy issues, much like I don't think you would tell the police chief how many auxiliary police officers that he would have at Oyster Run.
Mayor Miller?
Mayor Miller.
Chief Floyd first, and then I'll go to council, because I know all of you want to argue that point.
To Ms. Cleland's point, the intent of this camera would be to have the ability to move it around and address crime trends and try to discourage the crimes before they occur. And as I mentioned earlier, be able to collect the evidence if there is a crime that occurs within the camera's field of view. But I just wanted to make sure that our intent was clearly stated. This would not just be an event-only piece of equipment. And I figure if we're making a substantial investment, that we should try to get the most out of that. And so that would be us moving it around to wherever the greatest need is, and then certainly having it available for our larger scale events.
And again, before I turn it over to council, the cost concern, Marathon Refinery has agreed to cover that, much like they've covered costs for auxiliary patrol vehicles, things like that, public safety support, again, as a test bed, I guess. Okay, so who was first?
Mayor Miller.
Mr. Walters.
Well, and if Marathon wants to donate it to us, we don't need the sole source resolution. I do think that I agree with Mayor Miller that the discussion here isn't necessarily so much about whether the police should be authorized to deploy a camera on Commercial Avenue. I do think that we have a legitimate concern if we're talking about more than one. But also I have a legitimate concern if we're talking about more than one simply from the financial side, because I don't believe some of the representations from the manufacturer here about the necessity of the sole source. There are a lot of people making cameras. It seems to me sometimes these things get sold because they're better at marketing than others. I also I'm not very interested in ever hearing that, we got to do this now because Oyster Run's coming. Oyster Run happens almost every year except in pandemics. And so we do have time to plan for those kinds of things. But again, if we have somebody who's willing to pay for it, then we don't need the sole source resolution. I'd be okay with passing the sole source resolution with a cap on it, just to try this out, to buy one, to see if it works. I mean, we can get really involved in cameras and software and public records requests and where it's going to be deployed and all those issues. So it's definitely worth doing a test of that.
Well, can't we just make it set up right in the car in the front seat?
Before committing to a whole lot of them. And maybe we're not talking about that because, again, we were only talking about a $9,000 one. But I think in the instrument that we approve, we should have some kind of limit, upper limit. But that's, again, if we need to approve it at all. If somebody else is paying for it, then maybe we don't need to procure it.
Mayor Miller.
Mr. Carter.
I'm in agreement with Mr. Walters that having a cap on this one, but in the future, if anything else is needed, that we have a presentation kind of come forward to us to kind of show where the direction of the plans are going.
Mayor Miller?
Mr. Young.
I can agree with that as well. I think it's a great way for us to sort of move this issue forward. And if the chief believes this is something that's very useful, I agree. But, I do think, as Mr. Carter has indicated, that it is something that really should come back before full council for a presentation, and we can discuss whatever else about it that may be deemed necessary. Thank you.
So maybe I'm happy if council wants to direct the staff that it's for a single camera, because again, I think that'll help the policy discussion should there come as we implement this.
Really?
Mr. Walters.
And so to the previous question, do we need to do this at all if someone else is buying it, or are they just offering cash and we'll do the procurement?
That was the idea, that
okay.
They're offering cash.
All right, so let's put this on the table then as a motion. And I think all the points about the consent agenda are well taken, because we do have a set of procedures governing what qualifies for the consent agenda, and this isn't on the list of items that qualify. And with good reason, where we're waiving competitive bidding, we're waiving our policy requiring those protections to make sure that we're making good use of public funds. But so I move approval of resolution 3095 with the following amendment to section 2 to read as follows. The City Council of the City of Anacortes hereby waives the bidding requirements for the purchase of one mobile public safety camera system for use by the City of Anacortes and authorizes sole source purchasing from Security Alliance US.
Second.
Okay, I've got a motion by Mr. Walters and a second by Mr. Carter to approve Resolution 3095 with the change to Section 2 that adds the word "one" after purchase of and before public safety in Section 2. Mr. Franciac, would you take the vote, please? Mr. Walters.
Sorry, I also inserted the word systems, and because there are multiple cameras on the one item, so I wanted to make it clear.
Okay, sorry, thanks. So where's the word systems go?
Public safety camera system.
Got it, okay. After camera systems. All right, did you get that, Mr. Franciac? Okay, could you call for the vote, please?
Mr. Young.
Yes.
Mr. Walters.
Yes.
Ms. Cleland McGrath.
Yes.
Ms. Moulton.
Yes.
Mr. McDougall.
Yes.
Ms. Hubick.
Yes.
Mr. Carter.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay, thank you. Good discussion. Moving on to item 6, other business. Item 6A, ordinance 4029, hours and closures for parks and the Anacortes Community Forest lands. And I believe Mr. Walters is going to lead this one off. Mr. Walters.
Yes, Mayor Miller. So this ordinance would make a relatively simple change to our parks and ACFL code. Chapter 810 in the Municipal Code. On our Housing Affordability and Community Services Committee, we've had quite a lot of conversations about the camping, our parks, homeless people, where did they go overnight, those kinds of issues. A couple of years ago, we adopted code in Chapter 810 to fill out all the rest of the types of requirements that, and rules and regulations that you might want to have around parks and the ACFL. So for example, constraints on consumption of liquor, smoking, campfires, camping. There's a prohibition on camping in the ACFL, but it doesn't include a definition. So if you try to enforce it, you might run into some definitional problems if that were challenged and it weren't very obvious that you were doing camping. I understand that currently the police are excluding people from our city parks at 10 p.m. because that's what the sign in our parks say, but that sign isn't backed up by code. So what this ordinance would do is clearly articulate that our parks and the ACFL are open from 5 a.m. to 10 p.m., which is what most of the park signs say. There are a couple signs that say 6 a.m. instead of 5 a.m., but this would harmonize that. It would also provide explicit authority to the parks director to close a section of a park or a section of the ACFL, which you can imagine might be required for whatever reason, because the grass has gotten too much use, you know, because there's been a fire in this area, the ACFL or whatever. And it's a violation of this section to either be in an area that's closed or be in any area between those hours. And then there's also authority to grant special permission. So for example, some people might want to go to the top of Mount Erie and take astrophotography, which I've done, you know, after 10 p.m. You can get special permission to do that as well. So it provides that flexibility while articulating a uniform set of hours and creating an enforceable penalty associated with it. Now, we have been cautious about excluding people that are homeless from all areas of the city. We don't do that. We would be, with adoption of this ordinance, say you can't stay in the park and you can't stay in the ACFL. And a lot of our regulations governing the ACFL that we've adopted into this chapter were driven by that big fire that we had at Cranberry Lake and the possibility and probability that it was started by an errant campfire or cigarette or those kinds of things. We really have a lot to lose. So this would make that clear and provide enforceability. This is the first read, so we're not looking for any motion at this time. Pursuant to our rules, we would hear again at least one more meeting before taking action.
Mayor Miller?
Mr. Young.
Thank you. I guess my question would be, I'm hoping we can address maybe in further readings. I understand the purpose behind this effort, but I guess given that we have longer days now than we will later on when the days are much shorter, is that 10 o'clock timeline still something that we think is applicable? Because sometimes I think at a later date, you know, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, it's already dark. So how would that impact the 10 o'clock and the enforceabilities of that? That's just, I'm sure that's not something for this particular discussion, but that would be something I would like to hear a little bit more about in giving it consideration. Just the variance in more daylight versus nighttime starting so much earlier.
Thanks. Ms. Moulton.
Thank you. I think the idea is partly to be as accessible as possible to people and not be changing the hours based on the hours of daylight. I think we'll naturally see fewer people there during dark hours, but to give that option, if I do want to go stargaze in the forest lands or on top of Mount Erie, you know, it's going to be a lot easier to do it at 9:30 p.m. in the wintertime. So I think that consistency and accessibility are both important.
Mayor Miller.
Mr. Walter.
like-
Sorry, Mr. Carter.
I like having that, just across the board, having it the same at all parks and having that ability for someone to still be able to get into the park with permission for, you know, photography, things like that. So I'm for that.
Is there somebody else? No? Mr. Walters.
I think Mr. Young's point is well taken about the closing time. However, Mr. Lunsford, our Parks Director, did indicate a preference for keeping most of the signs the same, so he doesn't have to go modify them. On the other hand, it has been 10 p.m. closing for a very long time and advertised on most of those signs. So evidently, people are okay with this, with the 10 p.m. time working out.
And I think the main point of the ordinance is to make it enforceable, because we all know that there are some signs around town that we haven't found the ordinances to back them up, and this is one of many, and that's kind of the main focus there. But it is a good discussion to talk about it. But I'd rather not have to have Mr. Lunsford print up 100 signs. Any other comments, discussion, members of the public? Oh, okay. I've got Asa Dean. Yeah, please. And state your name.
Hello,
and
everybody.
city. Yep.
Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you. Go ahead.
Wonderful. My name's Asa Dean. I am here representing the Friends of the Forest, and I just wanted to sign on with our support for this ordinance. And for all the reasons stated above, I think it's important that we do have clarity and consistency with the opening and closing times of the forest lands, in particular in my case, but I think across the board for parks as well. And just in regards to Mr. Young's questions and what Ms. Moulton stated as well, is having that consistency throughout the seasons, regardless of when the sun is setting, I think is important for the citizens to be able to, number one, know when they're able to go out there, and number two, if we close at sundown in the wintertime, then folks are not necessarily going to be off of work yet, even at that point, and won't be able to access the forest land. So, for the enforcement of these hours and consistency, we fully support the ordinance that's been put forward by Mr. Walters.
Okay, thank you. So council, bring it back next week in case we get any more inputs on this. All right, getting the head nods. Okay, being there is no further business before the council, I'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you very much.